April 1945. Europe was burning out its final breaths of war. Cities lay in ruins. Armies were collapsing, and the world waited for peace that still refused to come. High above northern Germany, a formation of Allied bombers cut through the cold morning air. Their mission was simple: destroy every German train, bridge, and supply line still moving toward the front. No exceptions, no mercy. But then, one of the crews spotted something unusual below: a long white train gliding across the countryside. On every carriage a red cross, bold and unmistakable, the symbol of mercy, the one mark every soldier was taught to respect. Yet this late in the war, trust had become a fragile thing. Reports had circulated that the Germans were painting false Red Cross markings on ammunition trains to shield them from attack. Deception had become another weapon. Inside the bomber, silence replaced the hum of routine. Men who had dropped hundreds of bombs now hesitated. Was this truly a medical convoy, carrying the wounded and nurses home? Or was it one last act of German trickery to save a military transport from destruction? Their orders were clear: bomb all rail movement. But their conscience whispered something else. The pilot's hand trembled over the release switch. Every second that passed could mean the train escaped, or that innocent lives were spared. He finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy. "Hold fire." The formation stayed their hand. The bombs remained in their bays, and the white train disappeared into the mist untouched. It was a moment of defiance, not against command, but against the cruelty that war demanded. A moment when soldiers chose humanity over victory. The world would never know what exactly traveled on that train. But for those airmen, that decision would haunt and define the rest of their lives. The spring of 1945 was a season of contradictions. Germany was dying, yet still fighting. The Allies were winning, yet still bombing. The Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. Soviets closing in from the east, Americans and British from the west. But until surrender came, every factory, every bridge, every train was still a target. Allied bombers flew daily across Germany, determined to erase what was left of its war machine. By then, the air war had turned into a grim routine. Crews would take off before dawn, climb through icy clouds, and line up over ruined landscapes below, factories belching smoke, roads choked with refugees, railways winding through shattered towns. Every train that moved could mean troops, ammunition, or supplies heading toward the front. The Allied order was clear and brutal: if it moves on rails, it dies. But among the chaos of those final weeks, there were trains that didn't carry soldiers or weapons. They carried the wounded, the starving, prisoners of war, refugees. And some bore the unmistakable white and red markings of the International Red Cross, a symbol that was supposed to guarantee safety under the Geneva Convention. In theory, those trains were untouchable. In reality, trust had eroded long ago. By 1944, both sides had begun bending the rules of war. Allied pilots had seen German supply trucks painted with Red Cross symbols. Intelligence officers warned that the enemy was exploiting humanitarian markings to move equipment undetected. "Be cautious," one briefing note read, "but don't hesitate." To the airmen, mercy had become a liability, and yet not all saw the war in black and white. The crew at the center of this story belonged to the 447th Bomb Group, a squadron stationed in England, flying B-17 flying fortresses across occupied Europe. They were experienced men, veterans of countless missions. They had seen cities like Dresden and Hamburg reduced to firestorms. They knew what total war looked like, but they also knew what guilt felt like. On earlier missions, they'd watched bombs fall off course, onto farmhouses, schools, and churches. They'd heard the quiet rumors of civilian trains destroyed by mistake. For some, sleep no longer came easily. That morning in April, as the sun rose over Germany, their target was routine: a railway junction believed to be moving troops toward Denmark. The path to it crossed dozens of minor tracks, one of which carried that mysterious white train. From altitude it looked small, peaceful even. A thin ribbon of white cutting through green fields, its roof marked with giant crimson crosses visible from miles above. One of the gunners leaned forward and muttered, "You seein' that?" The pilot confirmed. The navigator checked coordinates. The radio operator waited for command. They all knew the rule. If you're unsure, call it in. So they did. But the reply from command was chillingly simple. If it's on German rails, it's fair game. The crew exchanged glances. War had a way of stripping choice from men. But not today. Not yet. As the bombers approached the release point, the captain hesitated. The train below wasn't moving fast. It looked orderly, even vulnerable. No camouflage, no flak guns nearby, just white carriages and the haunting red of mercy. He hesitated again. Orders screamed one thing. His conscience whispered another. That hesitation would soon spread across the entire formation, multiple bombers choosing to hold fire as they passed overhead. The sky, for once, stayed silent. And in that silence, a question began to grow among them. Had they just defied a lawful order or saved innocent lives? War is built on obedience. Every pilot knew it. Every soldier lived by it. Orders were meant to be followed, not questioned. But that morning, over northern Germany, doubt crept into the cockpit of men trained to silence it. The B-17 formation circled the area again, their engines steady and synchronized. Below, the white train continued its lonely journey through open countryside, through fields that were once farms, now scarred with craters and burned trees. The mission briefing had been clear. Eliminate all rail movement between Bremen and Flensburg. But no one had mentioned a hospital train. No one expected to see one moving so close to the front lines. Inside the lead bomber, Captain Robert Hale Peterson studied the scene through his bomb sight. He was 29, calm, decorated, the kind of man who had carried out dozens of bombing runs without hesitation. But something about this sight felt wrong. The red crosses on the carriages glared at him. Symbols not of the enemy, but of his own humanity staring back. "Sir," his co-pilot said, "orders are to drop." "We can't just—" "Stop!" Hale didn't answer. He looked again. No anti-aircraft fire, no armed escort, no camouflage, just white steel glinting in the pale sun. He keyed the intercom. "Navigator, confirm. That's a Red Cross train, correct?" "Affirmative, Captain." Multiple markings, all sides. The silence that followed was heavier than any flak barrage. Across the squadron, other crews were seeing the same thing. One after another, voices crackled over the radio, uncertain, nervous. "Command, this is Delta 2. We have Red Cross markings on our visual. Please confirm target authorization." No response. Just static. Seconds ticked by. Then finally a distant voice broke through. "Delta 2, proceed as briefed. All rail movement remains hostile unless confirmed otherwise." The message might as well have been written in stone. Destroy everything. The moral dilemma now sat squarely in the hands of the men above that train. Hale exhaled slowly. He knew what would happen if he disobeyed. Disobedience in wartime could mean court-martial or worse, being grounded in disgrace. His entire crew could be labeled insubordinate. But how do you justify killing the wounded? How do you drop bombs on white paint and red crosses and still call yourself a soldier? He gave the order. Hold position. No release until further notice. The rest of the formation began to fragment. Some held course, confused by the delay. Others veered off, unwilling to be caught in the act of hesitation. One bomber behind them didn't wait. It dropped its payload, 5 bombs, arcing down through the clouds. The crew watched in frozen silence as explosions tore into the ground hundreds of meters short of the tracks. The shockwave hit their aircraft, rattling the fuselage, but the train kept moving, untouched. It was a warning from fate, or chance, or something else entirely. Moments later, Hale spoke again, this time to his entire squadron. "Abort attack on the white train. Repeat. Do not engage the Red Cross convoy. Proceed to secondary target." It was a direct act of defiance. He had overridden a standing order. For the rest of the mission, not a single bomb fell near that train. The formation turned toward an alternate railway junction further west. The tension in every cockpit was thick enough to choke on. No one said it aloud, but every man knew. They had just crossed a line. The line between soldier and conscience. When they landed back at base in Suffolk, England, there was no applause, only paperwork. The mission debrief was quiet. Intelligence officers asked routine questions. Targets confirmed? Any enemy fire? Losses sustained? But when Hale mentioned the Red Cross train, the room went cold. One officer asked sharply, "Did you verify it was genuine?" Hale replied, "Sir, I verified it wasn't worth risking our souls." That didn't go over well. Within hours, an inquiry was launched. The squadron commander, Colonel Briggs, summoned Hale to his office. "You had standing orders," Briggs said, his voice low but burning. "Your duty was to destroy all movement. Why did you hold fire?" Hale stood at attention. "Because I saw the Red Cross, sir." "You think you saw it?" "I know what I saw." The colonel leaned back, exhaling smoke from his cigarette. "You realize disobedience like this sets a precedent. If every man starts deciding what he thinks is moral, we'll never win a war." Hale's answer was quiet but firm. "Maybe that's what makes us worth winning it." Briggs said nothing for a long moment. Then he dismissed him. No punishment followed, not officially. But something changed. The report from that mission vanished into classified files. The Red Cross train was never listed in official records. Hale and his men were rotated out 2 weeks later, sent to transport duty until the end of the war. Still, word spread quietly among other bomber crews. Some called him a coward. Others called him the only man brave enough to do what was right. And somewhere in northern Germany, that train, and the lives it carried, kept moving toward an unknown destination. Whether it truly was a hospital train or not, no one ever proved. But what mattered most was the moment it created. The split second when soldiers learned that even in total war, compassion could still find its place between orders and obedience. 2 weeks later, the sky over northern Germany looked the same, calm, pale, and deceiving. But for Captain Hale, nothing felt the same anymore. He and his crew had done something few men dared. They'd said no in a war built on yes. "Sir." The inquiry was closed without charges, but whispers followed him everywhere. Some called it an act of moral courage. Others called it hesitation. To command, it was best forgotten. To his men, it was unforgettable. Then came the letter. It arrived one damp morning at the airfield, stamped with the emblem of the International Red Cross. Hale opened it quietly. Inside was a short typed note, forwarded through military channels. To the pilots who spared the train marked with the Red Cross on April 12, 1945, the convoy carried 800 wounded Allied prisoners of war and civilian nurses evacuated from Neuengamme concentration camp. Many survived because no bombs fell that day. Hale read the words twice, maybe 3 times. His hands trembled. The silence that had haunted him since that morning was broken by relief and disbelief. The train had been real. The markings were genuine. He hadn't defied his country. He'd saved his own kind. But the letter wasn't meant for publication. The Red Cross wanted no publicity that could endanger their neutrality. The military quietly filed it away. There would be no medals, no speeches, just a faint acknowledgement that sometimes disobedience can be an act of duty. Still, Hale kept the letter folded inside his flight jacket until the end of the war. Days later, when Germany finally surrendered, the airfields erupted in celebration, flares in the sky, champagne bottles popping, men dancing on the wings of their bombers. Hale joined them, but the noise around him felt distant. He thought of the white train cutting through fog, carrying men who might be alive because he chose restraint over rage. In the weeks that followed, as Europe began to breathe again, a strange story started circulating among Allied bases. A rumor about a bomber crew who'd refused to fire, and been proven right. The story changed with each retelling. Some said it was over Denmark, others claimed France. Some said the train carried Germans, others said children. But one detail never changed: the red crosses on white steel, and the order that wasn't obeyed. Years later, when Hale was interviewed for a veteran's archive, he spoke carefully, never naming names or places. He said only this: "We were told to bomb everything that moved. But I saw something that didn't look like the enemy. It looked like decency, still surviving somehow, and I couldn't bring myself to destroy it." That simple act of restraint echoed far beyond that mission. After the war, Allied Command quietly revised airstrike protocol to include stricter verification before targeting trains marked with humanitarian symbols. The Geneva Conventions themselves would later expand protections for medical transports, using wartime incidents like Hales as examples of moral restraint in combat. But not everyone saw it that way. Some officers believed that mercy on the battlefield endangered others. That one spared train could mean 1,000 more deaths if the enemy used it for deception. To them, Hale's action was dangerous idealism. To others, it was the last shred of humanity in a war that had already lost too much of it. For Hale, there was never pride, only peace. When asked if he would make the same choice again, he didn't hesitate. "Every time," he said. "Because the moment you lose compassion, you stop fighting for anything worth winning." He returned home to Ohio in the summer of 1945. His crew scattered to farms, factories, and families. The war stories they told were about close calls and raids gone wrong, about bravery and survival. But the story of the Red Cross train was rarely spoken aloud. It didn't fit neatly into the triumphs or tragedies of war. It lived somewhere between them, in the quiet gray space of moral choice. And yet years later, a nurse who had been on that very train gave an interview to a British journalist. Her words, published in a small column, would finally bring light to what had once been buried in silence. She said, "We saw the planes above us, so many of them. We thought we would die that day. Then they turned away. It was as if heaven itself showed mercy." For Hale and his men, that was the only medal they ever needed. War ends, but memory doesn't. For Captain Hale and his crew, peace was not silence. It was a long echo of what they hadn't done. In 1946, the men of the 447th Bomb Group were scattered back into ordinary life. Some found work as mechanics, some became teachers, some never again set foot inside a cockpit. Yet every April, one date pulled them back into shared memory. The morning they spared a white train that no one else remembered. No medals, no official mention in military archives. Just a rumor whispered among veterans, the crew that refused. Years later, when Hale was invited to a war reunion in London, he was surprised to find a letter waiting for him at the reception table. It was written in careful, old-fashioned script. To Captain Peterson, "I was a nurse aboard the Red Cross train you spared. Many of us were British prisoners, wounded and afraid. When the bombers appeared, we thought the end had come. Then they turned away. Because of you, hundreds lived to see home again." Eleanor Grace, Royal Army Nursing Corps. He held the letter for a long time, longer than he had held any medal or citation. The world would call the Allied victory righteous. But Hale understood something deeper, that victory was built not only on strength, but on moments of restraint, when men remembered what they were fighting for, not just against. As the Cold War dawned and new conflicts began, the lessons of that day faded from history's headlines. But the Red Cross train remained, a small symbol of the line between necessary violence and unnecessary cruelty. Historians later uncovered fragments of documentation, reports from the International Red Cross confirming that, in April 1945, a hospital convoy carrying Allied prisoners and nurses had crossed northern Germany under heavy air traffic. It arrived safely at its destination. The route matched Hale's coordinates almost exactly. There was no official recognition, but in small ways, history began to catch up. A footnote in a declassified RAF document mentioned one American bomber group declining to engage a Red Cross transport, April 45. No names, no commendation, just the faint acknowledgement that mercy had existed, even then. For the men who were there, that was enough. Hale lived quietly until his passing in 1982. He never wrote a memoir, never sought credit. His logbooks were clean. No mention of disobedience, no trace of the decision that defined him. But tucked in a small envelope among his papers was that single Red Cross letter, folded, yellowed, and carried like proof that decency could survive war. In the years since, historians and filmmakers have debated the meaning of moments like his. Was it defiance? Was it faith? Or simply fatigue from killing? Perhaps it was all three, because in the end, what those airmen proved was something greater than strategy or discipline. They proved that even when surrounded by destruction, the human heart still recognizes life when it sees it. And that, maybe, is what truly separates war from murder. The choice to remember humanity, even when everything else is lost. The train itself was never photographed. Its passengers faded into history, but their survival became a quiet monument, not carved in stone or metal, but remembered in the conscience of a few men who looked down through the clouds and chose mercy. Long after the guns fell silent, one of Hale's crewmates, now an old man, said it best in a letter to his grandson. "We won that day not by what we destroyed, but by what we spared." And sometimes that's the hardest kind of victory. In the stillness that followed, the world rebuilt. The skies cleared, and somewhere in the archives of forgotten wars, the story of the train marked with red crosses remains. A reminder that even amid humanity's darkest hour, compassion still had wings.